Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back again with you guys for another show. And have we got a treat for you today? Because it's all about money. And don't we love to talk about money as Arsenal fans? Actually, that's a lie. We hate to talk about money right now as Arsenal fans. Some people think we got loads, some people think we got none, but we're going to try and give you the most comprehensive lowdown on everything today. I'm joined by my right-hand man, Drew, who is about 10 cups of coffee down this morning. Much appreciate you turning up, fella.
You can tell I'm way more awake this morning than last time, so I've already taken my coffee bath.
To be fair, just to give the listeners sort of a brief glimpse behind the curtain, I rang Drew about an hour and a half ago, which would have been 9:30, which is a normal time for a normal person to be awake, not Drew. Nope. But my car decided to have an absolute meltdown and start pouring water into the engine, which is great. So I had to get that sorted out. So this show was meant to be slightly earlier, but unfortunately we've had to push it back ever so slightly. So do forgive us for that. But we are joined by a fantastic guest today. It's Matt, aka Giant Gooner. How are you doing, mate?
Tom, nice to chat with you for the first time.
Yes, an absolute pleasure. I'm hoping that you can sort of answer a lot of ours and the listeners' sort of brooding questions around Arsenal's finances, because whilst we talk about this as being like the Tactical Breakdown podcast and we look at things analytically and we look at the matches, you can't really analytically look at Arsenal's transfer situation without knowing the finances and the situation behind it. So just sort of kick us off, Arsenal have had to go through this very strange, as every club has, very strange period of COVID-19. Can you enlighten us and our listeners as to the situation pre-COVID and then bleeding into the post-COVID period?
So let's start this from the end of last transfer window. Last summer's transfer window. Last summer was a really interesting window for Arsenal because it was the first window which we've seen under 100% ownership from KSE. I had discussed when the takeover of when KSE moved to 100% ownership by buying out Red and White Securities, the Alisher Usmanov and group. I had discussed over at Arsenal Vision in one of the two pods I've done over there about how it wasn't really something that should change the financial picture of the club in a material way. Subsequent to that recording, the club briefed the various reporters, Ornstein, that they were going to, the Kroenkes had felt, despite the fact that legally they had full control of the club before, they didn't want to take certain actions in terms of utilizing the balance sheet more because they didn't want those benefits to flow to Red and White when they didn't have 100% ownership. What we saw last summer was the first time that Arsenal spent money without leaving cash on the balance sheet to cover all future outflows for transfers. So, there was a lot of talk about installment payments last summer. And installment payments are like normal in transfers. Everybody does installment payments. But in the past, Arsenal felt the need to hold cash on the books for any future payments, which is ludicrously conservative, but at the same time, ludicrously conservative. Arsenal's finances has been a story for literally decades. Last summer, Arsenal spent some of the future money up front. I had estimated in August of last year that Arsenal had about 47 million of cash on hand, 47 million pounds of cash on hand, and a similar amount of money owed on transfers this summer. That's primarily Pepe and Saliba, who had long-term payment plans, whereas the Tierney deal was reported as Celtic having demanded that money up front. So my expectation last summer was that we might generate 85 million pounds of cash flow in the 2019-2020 season and probably be able to spend roughly that amount of money in the summer of 2020. Then a lot of things happened. The first thing that happened was that the team was a disaster. We're going to finish presumably lower in the Premier League than we have in a very long time. Every Premier League place is worth approximately 2 million pounds. So, if instead of we might have expected to finish 5th, if we end up finishing 7th or 8th, that's 6 or 8 million out. Then we got knocked out of Europe in the round of 32, which I don't even want to talk about, but I'm going to anyways.
We made it. Want to talk about it.
Exactly. I was there. I don't get to the match that often, sitting here outside New York, but I was at the Emirates for the Olympiacos match, and I wish I could forget that. So we had made 37 million pounds from the Europa League when we made the run to the final that ended in Baku. Speaking of things we don't want to talk about, that's going to be a lot less this year. I'm estimating about 15 million pounds less of income as a result of merit payments and TV payments that might be more like 20. Then you have to turn to the matter of COVID. And here I'm going to rely, and the original analysis I had done also relies heavily on the work of the Arsenal Supporters Trust, which is done by Simon Hill, not on Twitter, but these people, they do great work on the finances of the club. I know that on Twitter, their presence can be divisive because their spokesman can be divisive, but I think the behind the scenes stuff should be taken as gospel. They do really good work, and they have sourcing at the club, so they check their work rather than just going off what you can glean from the financials. They've estimated approximately £26 million of short-term damage to the P&L in terms of loss of match day income and loss of commercial and retail income over the remainder of the year ended June 30th, 2020. So if you just take that, that probably takes an £85 million budget and lowers it to £45 million. Now, then you can add the spending on Pablo Mari. That'll knock you further. Of the £45 million we might have had to spend this summer, that is probably about £15 million of it. So that knocks you down to 30. Then you have to ask the question about what the 2020/2021 season looks like. And that's not an answerable question. We just don't know what the world's going to look like at all. I think it's a fair assumption to assume that a significant portion of the season is going to be played behind closed doors. And that means that the club is going to operate at a loss. So in a typical year, Arsenal might do approximately £400 million worth of revenue, and approximately £100 million of that will be match day income. We have to assume that £100 million is going to go to zero. So if I thought that we might generate £85 million in a year of cash flow, just knocking the match day revenue to zero is going to eliminate that. Then add all the other expenses that are going to pile up. Operating a club to try to prevent COVID infections is going to involve a lot of spending on operational stuff that's designed to keep people from being on top of each other, on social distancing, basically. We're in a spot where people can't predict stuff. I have some professional business that touches on professional football, and I can tell you that players around the game do not know how much money they have. Like, I don't think Raul Sanllehi knows our transfer budget, which is not great. The good news is that that's a problem that lots of people have. If you've got Roman Abramovich's bank account behind you, you can go buy Timo Werner. But if you don't, which is almost everybody else, then you're in a really tough situation. You can't predict your revenue, which makes it hard to add new costs. So basically where I'm taking this to is we might have been in a spot where we could have spent some money this summer. 30 million net means then we sell players. There's always, random money that comes in, sell-on fees from guys, academy kids you sell for a few £1 million, places that money comes from that you don't expect. I think all those sources of money are going to disappear. So it's incredibly difficult to put a number to what the club can spend. But I think it's a prudent place to start of next to nothing, and then be pleasantly surprised if it's anything other than next to nothing.
So as we were talking pre-pod, and I think, just to be clear, the fact that you highlighted that we're not the only club in this fix is important, because I think, for better or worse, a lot of our fans do like to assume that we have a very unique situation where we have an owner, or we're in a financial position where we're essentially screwed. But I think it's important to highlight the fact that there's going to be a lot of clubs that are going to be struggling. And you've seen that across Europe as well. You've seen it in France, why a club like Toulouse was scrambling because they may have been relegated in the year that they felt they didn't deserve to, given COVID, and they avoided it. Other clubs in other big leagues, there's a lot of struggle in Germany. You've seen that. So the fact that despite our size and scope of Arsenal in terms of being a global powerhouse, certainly financially and arguably and from footballing terms, we're struggling. But that leads me to the kind of one of the topics we want to talk about is Kroenke's ownership of the club, KSE in particular. Now, we spoke pre-podcast about what their role can be in this, but as Americans, you and I both know, we have maybe slight more insight than the average Arsenal fan would involved in KSE, given their heavy involvement in the American sporting scene. So, what can KSE do, if anything, in terms of helping the club out with COVID? Were they hit by COVID very hard? How are their assets? I don't know what you're able to speak on, but what's your take on what you might expect to see or not see from KSE this summer, given the current picture of the club right now?
So I've seen a bunch of analysis that's been flying around, people saying that the Kroenkes have gained $400 million worth of wealth over the course of the COVID period. It's nonsense. It's insanity. It's based off of an analysis from Bloomberg Billionaires. And conveniently, I have an actual Bloomberg terminal, so I see more behind the scenes than people do when they go onto the website. Bloomberg calculates the source of the Kroenke family wealth as falling into approximately seven buckets. Arsenal, LA Rams, Denver Nuggets, their other sports teams, the ranches, their retail property business, and the wife, Ann Walton Kroenke's ownership stake in Walmart. Actually, it's not a direct ownership stake she has. She owns a 50% stake in a trust along with her sister that was responsible for 420 million shares of Walmart, which pay out a quarterly dividend of 54 cents per share. That's the good news. The good news is the Walmart part. All those shares are not shares that they can actually access, but at 54 cents per share over 210 million shares, that's 113 million gross per quarter. After a 15% dividend tax rate, they rake in 95 million of cash, US dollars, per quarter in dividend payments. That's the good news for the Kroenkes. The bad news is everything else. The Rams are a disaster. So they're in the process of building a new stadium out in LA that has been plagued by cost overruns, and there's supposed to be revenue associated with that from holding events. We're not holding events. There's a freaking virus going on right now. We can't be out in public. So they just took an additional $500 million loan out of the NFL's stadium fund. That's an incredibly attractive piece of paper. It's a 30-year loan at next to zero interest rates, straight line amortization. It's a really favorable piece of paper, but on the flip side, it's also, they have to pay this money back. So that's just a sign of the continuing problems that the Rams have. The Nuggets are a basketball team. The NBA has the best labor structure in North American sports in terms of the player salaries are going to go down, but they also have the most they're also heavily gate driven, much more gate revenue than TV revenue in the NBA. So the Nuggets will be sucking it. The ranches, it's tough to value. I mean, if they sell meat, they're in a bad shape because the U.S. meat supply chain is messed up. But then the other key source of cash to the Kroenke family is their retail property business. It's heavily grocery-anchored strip centers. It's also got a reasonable amount of low-quality outdoor malls. The grocery-anchored strip center business has been doing badly. You're talking about rent collections in the order of 50%. You're talking stock prices for like your sort of bellwether names are down, call it 50% from the peak. So in their core cash generating, the two sources of cash they get basically regularly are dividend payments from Walmart and rent payments from their shopping centers business. The Walmart money's fine, but the shopping center money is not showing up. So these guys are getting squeezed for cash flow on their boring investments. They're getting squeezed on the outflow side on the Rams for the expense of building the stadium. And all of their sports teams are sucking it because they can't let fans into the building. It's a pretty lousy time to be KSE in terms of trying to spend a lot of money, trying to stick a bunch of money into Arsenal Football Club. What I think is more likely that KSE could do, there's one clear step they can do. Arsenal keeps on the balance sheet every year a debt service reserve, which is, I need to scroll up and down in the debt service reserve was £36 million as of the end of 2019 financials. They'll always be roughly the same. What the Kroenkes could do is they could guarantee the debt service reserve. By putting a personal guarantee over that, they should be able to get the creditors to agree to let that money out. That's the step I could see them taking. But I don't see them moving any actual pound sterling into the club in this summer, given my best estimate of their overall financial picture.
Wow. I mean, that was so much information, and all of it. I've texted Drew on the side just to talk about where we're going next with the questions, and he texted me through while you were speaking, saying, "Tom, you look so disappointed."
Tom got the worst possible
good
news.
news.
You started off with the good news, and I was like, okay, and then pew, just straight down. But it's not surprising. That's the thing, is that this situation is completely unsurprising, and the one thing that no one knows really anything about, and as you say, Raul doesn't know what probably doesn't know what's going on in terms of the finances and the budget and what's going on with that, and no one really knows. And I kind of want to take the conversation into the sort of the speculation about what's going on, because there was a comment in the chat box. I'm just going to throw it up when I see it. Alvan said, what about the £235 million that he heard that we had? Because from everything that you said there, with the state of the Kroenkes, with all of their businesses, the state of Arsenal pre and post COVID, how is it that the media can then drum up this figure of 235 million? Is that a real thing? And if it is real, how much of that is being sort of blurred into people thinking that's what we've got to spend on transfers?
So 235 is, as Alvin says, from 2013. The hard number in the financial statements as of June 30th, so almost exactly a year ago to the day, June 30th, 2019, was 167 million of cash on the balance sheet, which is a really big number. The tricky thing becomes what we're going to do with that cash. I mean, first of all, obviously we spent a bunch of that cash. You know, we spent it on Tierney, we spent it on Pepe. We did the various transfers that we did last year. But the other reality is that, like, you need to keep a reasonable amount of cash on the balance sheet of a football club in order to run it. You know, there's everything from the payments you owe on transfers, but also just like operating, and like, this is a big business. There are, you know, thousands of people who work for or are contracted to the club. And so like any reasonable sized business like Arsenal needs to keep a significant amount of cash on hand just to like pay bills. Now then on top of that, Arsenal has always been run with a reasonable amount of fat on the bones historically. That speaks to, you know, that debt service reserve and stuff like that. That's mandated by the loan documents. But yeah, no, I think 235 that's just a historical number. That's 7 years ago. 167 is your starting point from today, the AST had estimated that 167 became 69 million of residual cash in practice, and the waterfall starts at 167, take up the 36 million debt reserve. Then we owed money last summer for previous summer's transfers, the money we owed Dortmund for Aubameyang, for example. You know, just like, you know, as was discussed heavily last summer, nobody does transfers where all the cash is put up front unless you're paying a Spanish clause or you've got Celtic being a bunch of jerks. We paid taxes, we had debt service. You know, it's basically 167 minus 36 for debt service, minus 30 for net player payments, minus 9 for tax and debt payments gets you to 92 million of spare cash. The AST then estimated that we spent cash out the door of 23 million in the summer of 2019. And then my comment on that was that I had a larger number, but the flip side is that they estimated a smaller cash outflow in the summer last year. That just means it's more money spent this year, because most of these transfer payments are largely, it's a 2-year cycle usually for paying out transfers.
So I know we're coming up a bit on time that we discussed. So this one thing we also mentioned pre-pod that we're going to have to almost begrudgingly go into a little bit, and that's something Arsenal fans love to talk about, is selling our own players. Again, I don't think the plan, as you said, the plan moving into the summer, I don't think that involved really kind of bidding some of your star assets. But given what's happened with COVID, given how hard COVID has hit KSC on multiple fronts financially, now more than ever, do you actually think that it's time the club actually has to strongly consider selling someone like Aubameyang as an example? It's not that rightly or wrongly, some people are actually championing that idea. Some people think that's borderline insane considering the things that we're kind of facing on the pitch. But from a strictly financial standpoint, given the fact that it's clear we might actually need more cash on hand to actually go through the proper processes of actually filling out the squad and worrying about balance and kind of building through the rebuild with Miguel Arteta, is that now something that you think the club should strongly look at? Not necessarily him, but just playing assets in general, and that also comes with the caveat of worrying about the wage structure as well, considering that's an absolute disaster. How much are these things going to really factor in this summer?
It's a tough question to answer because selling, you don't wave a magic wand and sell a player. You have to have a buyer, and the buyer has to have cash. It's tough to tell at this point how many buyers are going to be out there with cash to spend, and I guess we'll find that out. One factor we didn't discuss is at Arsenal and also at a lot of other clubs. When you look at the sponsors, like the sponsors are tourism. Emirates Airline. Now, Emirates Airline happens to have a sovereign state behind it, so they're not going to run out of money. As does Visit Rwanda, though Rwanda's sovereign state is a little less financially solvent than Abu Dhabi. But advertising revenue, marketing, commercial revenue is going to be reduced in the Premier League and in every top flight soccer league this summer. The bottom line is that, yeah, I think that we're in a spot where, all things being equal, we should be trying to sell players to reinvest in cheaper, younger, interesting talent. Like Aubameyang, I love watching Aubameyang. He's a fantastic player. But, the history of players who have not been affected by age is literally nobody. Time comes for everybody. He's not. Yeah. He's pushing 31. He plays every minute of every game. And when you sign a star player up to a new contract, I would hope the Mesut Ozil situation has taught us that paying up for aging guys, generally what you end up with on the back end is a disaster. Ted Knutson over at StatsBomb had argued a couple days ago that he wouldn't sign Thomas Partey on a free. Not because Thomas Partey is a bad player, he's a perfectly fine player, but because he's 27, he's going to demand a 5-year deal on Arsenal wages, and the last 2 years of that deal are going to be a white elephant. Our wage bill is loaded with white elephants. The best thing to do would be to ship some of those off, get whatever we could back for them. But the other question we should ask is whether or not it's worth selling some prime age pieces. A couple of years ago, when there was talk that Barcelona wanted to buy Hector Bellerin, everybody hated the idea. I hated the idea. It was obviously, on the face of it at that time, the right decision was to reject the advance wholeheartedly. Sitting here now in June of 2020, should we have taken a big clump of money from Barca for Hector? I love the guy, but yeah, we should have. I mean, did we know he was going to blow up his knee? No. But it's a nice reminder that, like, selling players, people hate the idea of selling players, like, in principle, but players move, players change. You root for the shirt, and you got to have some faith that Arsenal are capable of attracting talent of all sorts, and learning to trust. What have been the best signings, the most exciting signings we've done in the last couple of years? Gabriel Martinelli and Matteo Guendouzi. How many of us had heard of either of them before they signed, before they were linked to Arsenal? Those are the best signings we've done. Maybe we need to do more signings like that and less signings of guys we've heard of before. Maybe that'll leave this club in a better place, because buying a bunch of guys we've heard of has brought us to Brighton 2, Arsenal 1.
And it's quick to point out that clubs like RB Leipzig, Borussia Dortmund, Ajax, Liverpool have gotten better when they've sold players who were on the top of their supposed list of, key players and assets at the time. There was a period where Dortmund got rid of Lewandowski and Hummels in the same summer, and then they've kicked on. Liverpool as well. Coutinho left for big money. Off the back of Coutinho and a couple of the deals, they became champions of Europe. So, and I know the process sucks for fans, and we're used to seeing our best leave. We had that period where every top player on the club just decided to oust and just kind of fuck off for one reason or another. But I think fans are kind of hating that idea of replaying itself over again. But just on the strength of it from a financial picture, sometimes you got to take that hit and really kind of build for not looking about how we're going to do next season or even the rest of this season. It's about where we're going to be 3 or 4 years from now. So I'm with you on that. I think you got to start having to look at the market and buying talent that is undervalued or equally valued, not talent that's overvalued in the market, that's inflated, especially in the Premier League market, and then hoping that talent grows and really building a core through that. So,
yeah, I'd love, Matt, that you brought up about Thomas Partey, because I love the guy. Absolutely think he's an amazing footballer. I was saying on yesterday's podcast, talking about the Brighton game, that I wish we'd have signed him 2-3 years ago, because that's the age profile that we need to be looking at. And you sign Thomas Partey now, you sign a top-class player, right? We signed someone that arguably is a player that we've needed in our midfield for years and years and years and years. The issue is that we're signing him at the wrong point in time, and that is what you were exactly so spot on about, and what so many people miss is they look at the profile of the player's quality and they just completely skip past in terms of what age he is, what that would have an effect on his value, is there any sell-on value, etc., etc., and it just leaves Arsenal in a financially awful situation, and it leaves us with players like Aubameyang, as you said, pushing 31. We now can't find a buyer, even if we wanted to sell him, because originally we would have probably sold to Barcelona possibly in January. That's now not going to happen. Inter Milan were mentioned. I can't see that happening unless Lautaro somehow leaves for a lot of money, which in this climate is even now difficult to see. But with Barcelona, anything's possible these days. But it's just been, there's so much to cover in such a short space of time. But me and Drew really do appreciate everything that you've been able to divulge to us on today's show, and I hope everyone in the live chat really appreciates it as well. Giant Gooner, Matt, please tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter and go follow your stuff.
It is at Giant Gooner. It makes life simple. For people who are Patreon members over at Arsenal Vision, I also publish a statistical analysis of every match we play, notwithstanding the last two because they've just been too depressing. But lots of interesting stuff that you won't see anywhere else. And so, that's where you can find the stuff I do.
Amazing. Brilliant. We've really appreciated your words and your time, mate. So it's been an absolute pleasure.
A real pleasure. Cheers.
Thanks for coming, buddy.
Very soon, mate.
Bye.
Wow. I mean, wow. That is, I've longed for so long to just have someone on the show that genuinely knows finances and knows exactly what they're talking about. Because, and I think in the chat box as well, when people were asking about what about the £235 million, like, for me, I was asking that question. I was asking the question, what about the £235 million? Because I don't get where the money goes. And now I do. And very, very quickly before it disappears off my screen, we had a donation come in from Ariane Haidari, who turns out is behind the Julian Nagelsmann account from all those time ago.
You didn't realize that? Come on, it was either that or Mike. There's only two people who could have gotten.
I'm assuming he might have been the Tom's Hair account. I don't know who's created that. But he said, what effect would it have? A lot of players are on high wages, like Ozil, Alba, Mustafi, etc. And I think we're going to talk about the wage side of things. But before we go on to the wage, and we will come to your question, Ariane, I want to touch on sort of where this leaves us, because the bits that I wrote down while Matt was talking was this: £85 million was about where he expected Arsenal to be in terms of their budget for this coming summer. That then, because of COVID, got knocked down to £45 million, which seems in football an insignificant amount of money. Then after the Pablo Mari deal, it's gone down to £30 million because of the situation with that deal. And I was assuming when people were talking about the Mari deal that it was only going to be like 1 or 2 million this summer, and then eventually it would rise up to 8 million. But it turns out it's a lot more money than I had originally thought, which is crazy. And that leaves us with a £30 million mark, and in a year which we're most likely to make another loss, which could drag it down even further. Where is your head at regarding what Arsenal are this summer now?
I mean, I still maintain that, and that's kind of why I brought it up with Matt, is that this is a summer where we strongly really have to look at selling a or two key pieces of player assets, not because we want to, but because financially we have to. And if we're going to actually be able to really kick on with the rebuild under Arteta and look at the long-term picture of it, it's required. And again, as I said, we've seen other clubs in this league and in other competitive leagues in Europe do the same thing and come out on the right side of history and actually improve themselves. I mean, you don't win or you don't challenge in the Premier League by relying on 1 or 2 star players. You might have 1 or 2 star players in your 11, maybe 3, but the fact is that there's a certain level that has to be found throughout the team, throughout the squad, to be able to challenge to at least get Champions League, and I think all of us would be right in saying that right now we're pretty far behind all the clubs around us. You could even look at a club like Leicester, a club like Wolves, where you look at their first team options, their best 11s, and they're actually on par with us at the moment. Not on obviously we'll have some positions where we have a better talented player than they do, but on the strength of it, they're about even with us right now. And I think that's the worry that a lot of fans had maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was saying that there was so much money in the Premier League coming in at the time, where clubs that were historically far below our level are now, they've caught up drastically. And with what's happened with COVID, that's almost given clubs parity now. Another year of we're still on Arsenal's level, that's kind of not what we want to see. So I do think, again, but if you look at the long-term picture and squad building and the nature of how contracts work, and Matt went into that and you alluded to it, you look at someone like Oba, or even like I said, even though he's a couple of years younger, but these are players that are coming up on their latter years of their career. Oba's on the wrong side of 30. He's a player who, despite his goal-scoring instincts, he relies heavily on his ability, on his pace. It's his movement that really has made him such a dangerous goal scorer over the course of his career. And most players, even if they avoid an injury, and Oba's done incredibly well to avoid it, he's not had a serious injury the entirety of his career, which is actually incredible. It speaks to how fit of a player he actually is. But his game is so predicated on his movement. As you get older, you eventually just lose that. Even the best athletes of all time, eventually you just get slower as you age. That's how the body works. And why would you extend a guy whose game is so predicated on something he himself really can only control but so much, that his value is just going to depreciate over the market over time, and then you're going to find yourself in a position where if you extend him, by the time his contract comes to an end, you're going to get a fraction of what you could have gotten 2 or 3 years prior, or he's just going to run it down to nothing and then move on and then get that one last big deal, maybe somewhere like China, MLS, wherever it might be, and then he's finished. And do you want to put ourselves in that position, especially when you can cash in arguably for maybe a little bit less than what we would have gotten last summer, or in January, but it's something we have to really consider. And then we didn't even touch on the wage structure yet. Someone, and that's a whole other bag. You've got to worry about Oba and Laka's contracts. You got Mesut Ozil's contract. You got Mkhitaryan's contract. Like these are it's so much money off the wage, but we really have to do our best to shift. And then you just got to reinvest properly. And there's an article I've been chucking around, on the Twitter sphere lately. Manuel that wrote a really, really good article and really good analysis about market value and clubs that are spending what they're spending on and how their market value has risen in correlation with how they've spent. And the clubs I've dropped before, Dortmund, Leipzig, Liverpool, Spurs, Chelsea, these are clubs that have spent a certain amount of money and their market value has gone up a considerable amount because they're buying players who are young that have potential, and they're seeing that potential at those clubs, and their market value is raising. So even if those players don't stay at the club, they can be sold on for a considerable profit, and that's something that we really haven't hammered down. I mean, Ajax make a living out of that. That's why and I just mentioned last night in the thread that if you look at Chelsea's business, everyone kind of lauds Chelsea about, or not lauds it, they get Chelsea about having a completely stacked youth system, and these players aren't getting time. They're not buying youth players just to see if they make it at Chelsea. They're padding the youth system because it's, the best of the bunch will come out on the other end and might have a career at the club, and the ones that don't will be sold on for a massive profit. And that's why they really utilize that deal with Vitesse Arnhem, because they're sending players there for 2 or 3 years. Lewis Baker's a prime example. He was brilliant for Vitesse Arnhem for a couple of years, but he never made it at Chelsea, but they still sold him on, for a considerable amount of money. And I mean, in hindsight, they did it right, but no one knew that a formula like that may have been something that, clubs are going to have to really focus on now. So, I mean, it's a tricky one, but I mean, and I know we hate the notion of, I know we hate the notion of getting rid of players, but again, that's part of professional sport. It's very few and far between that you see a player come through at a club and stays there for 8-10 years and finishes at a club. Those days are gone at this point. It doesn't work that way anymore, really. And if it does, it works that way at a lower level, at smaller clubs in top leagues or smaller clubs in the second tier, the third tier, where you can make a career in one club. But normally now, you're lucky if you get to play for 3 or 4 years, 5 years at the club, and then it's just a different time now. So
the bottom line is, when we're talking about how Arsenal can move forward to spending money, is that we need to sell to reinvest. It's the only way it's the only way that we're going to be able to reinvest in. If the Partey deal excited me so much at the start, but the more that I've educated myself and listened to other people talk about it, it's just put me off that deal completely, because it's going to be another situation where we get dragged into having a player a 4-year contract, ends it when he's 31 years old, and either we sell him on for barely anything, like we'll probably see with Aubameyang, where I'd be surprised if we got 20 million at this point because of the contract situation and his age. People might go 20 million for Aubameyang, but when you have to factor in everything about his age and the years of contract left, and the fact that he probably wants to go and he could go in 12 months for free, 20 million is probably not a bad deal right now in this COVID situation.
Especially with the wages he's going to likely want to demand as well. He's going to want at least parity minimum.
Where's he going to go? China. China's like the only place he can really go to, because the other European clubs are not going to pay Aubameyang the wages that he's after, and they ain't going to pay the fee that Arsenal probably demand for him. The thing is with Arsenal right now is that even in this situation, is that I can't see Arsenal being mature about this and actually thinking, okay, we've got to cut our losses and probably take whatever we can for these players so we can actually try and reinvest in some younger talent. And not only that, but we're not Manchester United that are currently being linked with Jadon Sancho, right? It'd be great if we could get linked with someone of the same sort of caliber of that age as Jadon Sancho, but it's just not possible because we've just not got that sort of financial backing from our owner. So we are a self-sustaining model, which is irritating, but also it shouldn't be irritating because we're seeing clubs like you mentioned, like Liverpool, achieving amazing things on a self-sustaining model. And I think, and I've said it over and over again, that we need to adopt the RB Leipzig model of signing players under a certain age only. Yep. And only do you ever break that mold if it's someone that you get in for a year as an emergency cover, and that is it. And that is the only time you ever break that mold, because RB Leipzig protect themselves. And you always say, like, there's a fantastic analogy of a millionaire asking to borrow £1 off someone, and when someone asks, well, why you're a millionaire, why do you need to borrow £1? It's like, well, that's how the rich stay rich. It's like you try your best not to spend. You try and keep your capital as high as feasibly possible by maintaining the amount of money that you have. And to do that, you need to be able to bring in young players and you need to sell them on. And I had a really annoying, and I'll get your thoughts on this, I had a really weird argument with Terry from the Football Terrace, and this is about 2 months ago. And it's not me staking Terry in any way. It's all public on there, so it's easy to see. And me and Terry got on really well. But the point is that we had a debate about it. That he said that United did really well by not signing Eric Braut Haaland. Because he said that he doesn't want Man United to look like a selling club. He said that all of the control would have been in Haaland's court because he would have been able to sign for them for this amount of money and then probably would have demanded a big release clause, which he then would have moved on from. And I said, well, I don't really see the point. And I don't see the criticism in that whatsoever, because I don't think by signing Haaland and then selling him on for, say, double the amount or triple or quadruple the amount that you signed him for after he's bagged the loads of goals for you at the club is necessarily a bad thing. I think Matt touched it on the head when he said that a lot of people get really frustrated by seeing players leave. But that's because they put their own selves in the shoes of the player, treating that player like they're a fan of the club. They're not. They're an employee. Employees move on. You move jobs. You move employment. So for you, would you really look any less at Arsenal? In fact, maybe would you even look better on Arsenal if they started to adopt a situation where they sign players younger, and yes, we might lose them when they're a lot better, but we lose them for a lot of money and then we can reinvest it. Would you look at Arsenal any less for doing that?
I mean, you know my background. You know how much I love German football, how much I love Dutch football. I'm always, a fan of the fact that I'm not a fan, but a proponent of you can't tie yourself down to a player. Here's a prime example. Mats Hummels came through Bayern Munich's youth system. He then left Bayern, went to Borussia Dortmund, then left Borussia Dortmund for Bayern, and then went back to Borussia Dortmund. So, I mean, and as far as I remember, off the top of my head, Mats Hummels was Bavarian born, so he should, in theory, have ties to the club to where he would never consider leaving it, but he left it twice. Once because he wanted to leave because he wanted to play, and another time because he was no longer wanted by the club, so he left. But the fact is, it doesn't really matter if you come through the system. Doesn't matter if you were brought in at a younger age, like someone like a Hector Bellerin. It just, whatever the circumstances might be, players are going to leave now. And I think most clubs in Europe, especially most big clubs in Europe, understand that fact. And it's very rare that you see a player come in unless you're already at the highest level in Europe where they're going to stay with you. You find players who will stay at the likes of Barcelona, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich. These are the clubs that are at the top tier of the game. So why would you want to leave? But a club like Arsenal is not in that position, has not been in that position for years. And when you're a player, when you reach a certain level of your career, I mean, people kind of knock it, but if I'm a player in my prime years and I haven't won anything, why would I want to stay? If my goal in my career is to actually win something in my career, why would I stay in a place where I'm not winning anything? And we have to factor that in, not just as a human being, but as a professional athlete. Some professional athletes are fine with having a good career, and if they win nothing, then they're fine with it. But a lot of them are competitive to the point where winning is an absolute must for them. And I think that's why if you look at someone like Leo Messi, he takes it so hard that Argentina never won anything when he's been playing. Regardless of the comparison that's been made with Maradona, Messi wants to win. Messi's been brought through Barcelona and all they do is win, historically, when he's been there. So that's why you look at him, he's so dejected when Argentina eventually crash out in the quarterfinals yet again. So, again, I'd be more than fine with bringing up the approach that I keep saying. If you look at players, and I think Gabriel Martinelli is that prime player. He came from the fourth tier of Brazilian football. No one knew anything about him unless you were tapped into the Brazilian footballing scene. You didn't know who the hell he was. He came in, he won his spot. People are now arguing that he should potentially be the first choice left winger for Arsenal Football Club moving forward, starting now or next season. And no one knew who he was 12 months ago. And it's interesting because Arsenal has done a lot of business in its recent history in the Premier League era of bringing in players who little was known about them, and within 2 or 3 seasons, they were fantastic for the club. So I don't see what the problem with that really is, and especially given the financial, issues revolving COVID and the Premier League, and we don't have the type of billionaire owner that Abramovich is, that the Etihad Group is. We don't have the Kroenke. He has a high net worth, but he's not that kind of owner. He doesn't have that kind of cash to say, here you go. He's not Scrooge McDuck. He's wealthy, but that's not. He doesn't have a pot of gold in the backyard that he can just dip into all the time. So we kind of have to be creative now, And I think that there's so much talent globally in football where players just are in the smaller market where they have high-end ability, high-end potential, and you can get them for lower fees. And that's why if you tap into markets like the Dutch league, the Belgium league, Croatia, Austria, leagues like this where players can come in and do wonderful things. There's a recent link with Jonathan David, and people saying that's a good option. If you look at Bayern are a global club, but they put a lot of faith in Alphonso Davies, and with luck, with massive injuries in their defense, he got a chance and he took it, and look at the results. So. I'm all for that. And then someone brought it up in the YouTube chat before, and you'll know this because we've spoken about this, how much that I said I would have rather bought Steven Bergwijn over Nicola Pepe in the summer. Not because Pepe's a bad player, but if you look at the financials of the deal, it made more sense. What's the likelihood that, say we sold Pepe on 30 years from now, what's the likelihood that we'll actually get a massive return on the investment we made in him? Probably pretty slim, because we paid so over the odds for a player who he was gifted, but he was heavily overvalued. That deal almost kind of screws us financially in a way, unless he has a brilliant Arsenal career and he doesn't want to stay. We're never going to sell him for 120, 130 million pounds. It's never going to happen. No. When you buy someone like Bergwijn for under half that price, you could see Spurs eventually selling him for 50, 60 million and doubling their investment. That's the kind of business that you need to do. And that's the kind of business that has Spurs in the top 10 list of clubs who know how to navigate the market and shop for value and for ability relative to value, and then improving it. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's not the end of the world. But the bigger question we haven't even touched on with Matt, maybe we should have, is can we see this happening under Raul or not? That's a whole other discussion, and we'd be here for another hour. But so there you go. There's a couple of things I want to just say before we wrap up, and it bleeds into some of the comments in our comment section. First of all, Ariane, thank you ever so much for another donation. Also, Liverpool sign players based on good analytics and markets where big teams, season Chelsea's, weren't looking in, which is very, very true. But there's a couple of comments that came up that I wanted to pick on, and this isn't me picking on people. It's just because I kind of see the fan point of view, which is what we're trying to get across, which is the issue. And Alexander Choi, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, mate. He brought up with the first thing. He said, you need experienced players. Experienced players carry you through the tough games. And he said, furthermore, Leipzig and Dortmund haven't necessarily won many league titles with that system or go very far. I mean, there's a big reason for that being Bayern Munich. It's one of the big reasons why they haven't done that, and other teams. But the point is, Alexander, that we're trying to make here is that
experience is important. And if you look at Arsenal's golden era, which is the early 2000s, late 90s, we had players at the club that were experienced because they were signed young and they were developed at the club and they were brought through. You look at that Invincible side and you look at the players that were signed at a younger age or were being brought through the youth academy, Thierry Henry, Ashley Cole, these players that are being brought through that had Premier League experience because they were developed at the club. We then signed other players that would support them, but they weren't necessarily very, very old, and the very, very old players that came in, the 30 pluses, weren't coming in to start every single game. They weren't being as integral parts of the team. The players that started in the golden eras were those players that came in at a younger age and were developed, and they had Premier League experience, sure, but they came in at a younger age. You can sign your David Luiz's, you can sign your Stefan Lichtsteiners, but they're not, that's experience. But as Jamie Carragher said after the game the other night, experience is a very, very overrated quality. And it's actually, ironically, quality is what you need. Experience might get you so far and it might be great. And I was wrong the other day when I put out a video about Thiago Silva saying, yeah, we should go and get Thiago Silva for a year because it'd be great for Saliba. So
I'd absolutely hate that if we did.
I looked back on that now like, what was I talking about? Because I don't want to sign Thiago Silva on the wage that it would cost to bring him. I don't want that anymore. My view has changed on all of this because of reading and doing research. People need to open their minds more. And I really appreciate everyone that's come on and listened to this. And I hope that you've learned a lot by coming on and doing so, Quadro.
Real fast. So I want to talk about the experience thing real fast. I think you've hit it right on the head. Experience is something you look to when you need to fill 2 or 3 positions in the squad so you get that experience, but it's not something you actually focus on. And I want to bring something up. So everyone talks about how good of a club Bayern are, both how they're run, how they're playing, types of players they attract. So what if I was to tell you that Bayern have a younger average squad age than we do? Yeah, they're absolutely destroying the Bundesliga, who, I'm sorry to people in the chat, the Bundesliga is actually incredibly competitive. Just because Bayern win it year in, year out, that is strictly for financial reasons only. They're the only club in Germany that can support that level of player personnel on the wages.
I mean, they bailed out Dortmund, didn't they?
And they compete in they can compete in a market. And you have to look at the culture in Germany. It's very much for a lot of these players when they were coming through when they were younger, and even the generation before that, the whole goal was to play for Bayern, whether you're Bavarian or not. That's the pinnacle. That's the pinnacle of German football is Bayern Munich. So if you can go there, you go there. And that's why you see the likes of Leon Goretzka winding down his contract to go to Bayern Munich. You know, it's why Mats Hummels went back to Bayern Munich. It's why Lewandowski left Dortmund for free to go. That, you know, and Mario Götze. These are the reasons why those things happened. They were all at very good clubs, and then they went to Bayern. It's no different than someone in Spain coming through and eventually wanting to go to Barcelona or Real Madrid. It's the same exact thing. You know, Manchester United had the grip on English football like that for years. You know, I want to go play at Liverpool. Same thing. It's no different. The difference is that Bayern have the cash to burn, where other German clubs don't really have it, and the TV money is so less in Germany than in the Premier League, where clubs can't even rely on that. But yeah, Bayern's average squad age is 25 years old. Ours is 25.6, 25.7. Yeah. So, you know, when you have someone like a Lewandowski or whatever who is on the wrong side of 30, you're still talking about players like Alphonso Davies. You know, you had Joshua Kimmich come in. Some of the players.
The ages are so split. We're just completely the two ends of the spectrum. That's why it is 25.7. As you might think of that being as quite just like you're thinking, oh, everyone's in their prime, but no, we're in a horrible situation where we've got really early 20s, sub 20s, and then late 20s and 30 pluses, and that puts you in a really, really awkward situation to not have enough players in that middle ground. Pepe is probably one of the only examples that you've got really of one of those quality players in their early mid-20s that can develop and can improve. But even then, I still felt we overpaid for Pepe for sure, and we could have spent that money elsewhere. And I think that people really need to take a look at the Leno situation, because the Leno situation for me is going to really show people how Arsenal deal with this. And what you'll probably see is I'm seeing links to the likes of Joe Hart as being a possible someone that comes in to sort of be that guy that does him for a year. But that's not what Arsenal should do. Arsenal should go out and look at younger keepers that are sort of early 20s that have got a year left on their deal at their current club, or less than a year left, or in fact are running out of their deal. And they should go out and sign someone like that cheaply that's got lots of potential that could even supersede Leno at the club. Not go out and panic and go and get Joe Hart or someone of that ilk, because it doesn't work. It perpetuates the problem that we've already got going on at the club. And it's just so irritating to see the likes of Raul and Edu to a lesser extent. I can't judge Edu too much because we've not seen enough of what he's about yet. And Raul has so much power within the club that he's signing the wrong players. And what's so frustrating is that these guys earn so much money. And me and you, Drew, can sit here and know exactly what Arsenal need to do. And I'm teaching and you're coaching. And but the thing is, and loads of people in the chat box as well know exactly what Arsenal need to do. And the most frustrating thing is that it just doesn't happen. It just never happens. I feel like if we carry on too much longer, and have an aneurysm. So we're gonna have to pause there, I'm afraid. But thank you ever so much, everyone in chat, for tuning in. A massive Thank you to Matt Giant Gooner for coming on. He was absolutely fantastic. You can find him on Twitter at Giant Gooner. That's 2 guests in a row that have been able to get their dream Twitter handles with at Sam Lee and at Giant Gooner so far. Drew, it's been a pleasure as always, mate. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, buddy. Of course. Thanks for having me as usual.
No worries whatsoever. So in terms of shows that are coming out this week, tomorrow we're going to have either a big question or, depending on if someone gets back to me, a tactical breakdown on, fingers crossed, a very young Czech Republic international prospect, which could be quite interesting if someone gets back to me, which I'm not hopeful for at the moment. So it could be a big question show. And then on Wednesday, it'll be the preview show for Southampton, which is going to be fun. And then the Raw reaction show straight after the game, followed by another podcast on Friday. Stay safe, people. Stay well. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you have, drop a like on it, drop a subscription, and drop a join if you want to become a member like some of the people have in the chat box today. Follow Drew on Twitter at FM Lera. Follow us at the Gooner Talk TV. There's nothing else left to say, but in the most somber way possible, up the Arsenal.